Hola amores, welcome back to my channel. Today's video, or the third of today's video, is another VBX Familia Speaks video. I've been getting so many requests, like I said in my previous videos, so I'm trying to just, crank them all out and get them done. Because again, I'm just like constantly receiving requests, which is a good thing. Y'all are giving me content, that's great. But yeah, so this is the third video for today. So the topic of today's video, which was requested to me by, I believe another fellow Latino, was on this topic of blanqueamiento or whitening in Latin America. Now, when it comes to the topic of race within Latin America, I know many Latinos like to have this idea that race is a non-factor and that we don't deal with racism or colorism or anything like that, especially when you consider the fact that most Latin American populations are so heavily mixed. So people look at that and think, oh, we don't deal with racism because look at how everybody of different races was mixing. And while some of that race mixing was, people's personal choices, there is also the factor that some of the governments of these countries were literally promoting it in order to dilute that African and sometimes even that native DNA. So in reality, even some of our mixedness comes from racism. So anyway, the official definition of blanqueamiento or whitening is a social, political, and economic practice used in many post-colonial countries to improve the race, or mejorar la raza, a term I'm sure many of you guys have heard before, towards a supposed ideal of whiteness. So from a social perspective, this was catering to white dominance in social hierarchies. And then from a biological aspect, it was the process of whitening by marrying a lighter-skinned individual to produce lighter-skinned offspring. So while researching this topic, most of the information that I found pertained to Brazil and Cuba, since these were two countries that actually enacted government policies to encourage this. But since we're only focusing on the Caribbean here, I'm not going to talk about Brazil. I'm just going to focus on, the Caribbean countries. So looking at the Caribbean, this whole process of whitening, it wasn't as big a thing in the British or French-speaking Caribbean. So, yeah, most of the topic or the information on this topic as it pertains to the Caribbean is mostly focused on Cuba, followed by Puerto Rico, and then I did find some information on DR as well. So blanqueamiento was enacted in many Latin American policies between the 19th and 20th century. And in most cases, these policies promoted and heavily encouraged European immigration into these countries as a means to whiten the population. Now, starting with Cuba, at the dawn of the 20th century, Afro-Cubans, they had joined the struggle for independence against Spain in hopes of building a nation based on racial democracy. However, the U.S. presence in Cuba from 1898 to 1902, and then again from 1906 to 1908, propped up and, defended of having a racist ruling class, which pursued policies that actively sought the whitening or blanqueamiento of the nation, okay? So at the beginning of the 20th century, the Cuban government created immigration laws that invested more than $1 million into recruiting European families into Cuba to whiten the country. And so the high participation of Blacks in independence movements threatened the white elitist power, and when the 1899 census showed that more than 1/3 of Cuba's population was colored, white migration started to gain support. So political whitening began in 1902 after the U.S. occupation, where migration of undesirables, as they would say, or basically Black people, became prohibited in Cuba. Immigration policies supported the migration of entire families. And so between 1902 and 1907, nearly 128,000 Spaniards entered Cuba. And officially in 1906, Cuba created its immigration law that funded white immigrants. However, many European immigrants would not stay in Cuba and many would come solely for the sugar harvest. And by the 1920s, Blanqueamiento through national policy had effectively failed. So basically, as many, although Cuba did have an influx of all these white people, a lot of them also ended up later exiting. And I think even more left when Castro came into power. So they're an example of a country where this process of Blanqueamiento was a fail. Now, looking at Puerto Rico, as I've stated in previous videos, tens of thousands of Europeans came into Puerto Rico during the 19th century, especially from the Iberian Peninsula and the Canary and Balearic Islands. So this was promoted officially by the government since the late 17th century. And the influx of peasants from the Canary Islands continued throughout the 19th century. Later, other ethnic groups would arrive from outlying regions of Spain, such as the Catalans, Majorcans, people from the Basque area. Then you had Austrians, Galicians. And so the migration of all of these European families would cause an ethnic whitening on the island. So apart from the biological whitening that was occurring, there was also a social whitening, which in Puerto Rico took on the form of basically ethnic self-identification. So, for example, when examining the Puerto Rican census in the different ethnic categories of the population, the self-categorization of white became an increasing trend. And so, looking back at historical data, the largest proportion of people of color was recorded in 1820, and that was at 55.6%. However, in following decades, this would continue to reduce. And by 1864, 52.4% of the population was now identifying as white. And then, so the category of white, this would remain intact, and the percentage of the population that was being accounted for as white just continued to increase and decrease. By 1899, 61.8% of the population was identifying as white. And then when you fast forward all the way to the year 2000, you now have 80.5% of the population identifying as white. So in Puerto Rico, you saw, both sides of this Blanqueamiento happening. You had the biological whitening, which happened as a result of all the European families that came into Puerto Rico. And then you also have the social whitening from more and more people identifying as whites. And I mean, granted, the Europeans would identify as white, but you also had mixed people who may have had a white grandparent or someone white in their ancestry also identifying as white. Now, when it comes to DR, the Dominican government didn't exactly enact a law or policy to the same extent that some of these other countries did, encouraging the mass immigration of European families. However, when it comes to the Dominican Republic, the process of whitening has been held more so within the Dominican population by encouraging that one marry or procreate with someone whiter and lighter than them, or with someone that has features that are more closely aligned or considered to be European features. And we got some Dominican YouTubers on here actually encouraging this shit, but whatever. So in my experience, my parents never told me that I should marry or be with someone whiter or lighter than me. However, I will admit that my mom did used to tell me to make sure that I had kids with someone that had good hair, so that my kids would have good hair. And so, I guess you could say to an extent I did kind of internalize that. So even if I was, say, maybe looking at a darker skinned guy, I would look at his hair texture, just keeping it real. Now, some do have a theory that when Trujillo brought over the Jewish refugees in the 1940s, that this was low-key an attempt at trying to whiten the population a little bit. Also, many believe that when Trujillo brought over the Japanese immigrants in the 1950s, that by purposely placing them closer to the Dominican and Haitian border, that this was done as a way to try to racially landscape those areas, which I guess he considered to be too black. So Again, you see this idea of trying to whiten the population, even if it was among the very Dominicans, by encouraging them to marry with whiter and lighter people. So those were the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So when it comes to the rest of the Caribbean, I couldn't really find much information on whitening. I did find one article, though, that said in Jamaica, there were more than 1,000 Germans that were brought into Jamaica with the promise of being granted housing, land, and employment. However, the white immigration never amounted to a whole lot because mixing with the black population, and also many of them would migrate to the US. So that depleted much of this population. However, you can see remnants of these Germans that came in. So many Jamaicans in Seaford Town and Germantown carry heavily European features such as blue eyes, blonde hair, freckles, and light skin as a result of the German genetic influences. So with all this being said, I think all of this just proves that, we have all been a product of colonialism one way or another, just like everyone else. Sure, our histories may have played out a little differently than, say, maybe here in the United States. But, despite all the race mixing and stuff that happens in most of the Latin American countries, the racial hierarchy never fully disappeared. And at the end of the day, whiteness has always been deemed most desirable and something that you should try to somehow try to aspire to by, marrying somebody whiter than you. So, it is what it is. It's a part of our history that as Latinos, we may not always want to recognize, but, it is what it is. You can't rewrite history. So that was it for this video, guys. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!